I'm being that person. Okay, I believe it's happening.
I think it's frustrating to have a lot of time as well, so probably the combination
Yeah. I think that's happening. I'm like, yeah, it's all right, isn't it? Sorry.
Let me check.
Is this just the name and the... Okay. Good. Yeah. We can privately like get them going. Wow.
Right, okay, that's great. I'm sorry that you had to come. It's still well, I have to go back on Monday. So we might
I'll make a yes case.
Good background, like how it started. Yeah.
Facial
Yeah,
recognition.
so they kind of partnered up, so it's called Skelf and Podcast, but he does a podcast that he does something exhibitions on the website. So we were doing Entangled one, and I think he's bringing out a new podcast. Yeah, there's another one on Wednesday. So it comes today. He's pretty, those minutes to do right now. He's very like, he's very diligent. He's going to be here with an office at 5, maybe here at like 10 to 11. Yeah.
Singing like this background.
Yeah.
Can you have a singing background? It has like something in between. If I, have you not going to put like
You guys want to take a seat? Yeah. And it'll be on the right side feed because the extension.
Should I go here on this one, right?
So if someone can go as far in as possible, that'd be good. Just because I think.
I'm gonna get in and then speak about it. I guess I'll be outside.
Yeah. So initially, Erin's going to present on behalf of CypherBILLBOARD. Yeah. And then I can join the discussion. I'm going to be.
Yeah.
We all have a thing. I can't even read.
Yeah, she's just finishing up.
Tell us when you need to start, and we like.
Erin, where are your images saved? Yeah. Sorry, I'll get it down so you can see. Yeah, that's it on YouTube. I can quickly put my phone on to record. Shall I do that?
Do you think maybe we should do it so or is it all around it?
I started to get tennis balls
I don't
back
mind that. It was like
rolling it. You need to be careful like that. I'm an old lady, and then not to put that. She will be hardly get a lot older. So this is I start exercising. One shoulder, like upper back, doing the don't push it more.
Yeah, it's delayed.
I bought tea but
Yeah, I haven't had a look at the scales. Yeah.
frozen, okay, now that's done.
Can you see if anyone's actually watching it? Does it tell you?
Let's thank him up. Poor connection.
Yes, it says 2 people watching,
Oh no.
which is one of them's us.
One is Emma. One is Emma.
So 2 is.
You've got to see. Oh, thank you. I still have it on. That's amazing. Yeah. I like the the 2 things of them were really different in feel. Like the second one was much more muted and more kind of.
The guy didn't say
not
he
really
should
bright.
try
And a bit like the kind of these cool colours.
I think
And then the second one.
maybe you.
them up, they're up.
Yeah. Because I woke up the other day and I was like, I didn't send them through.
Yeah,
And I was like, oh, the show's over now. Okay, cool. I just.
So, which of
We have the
all?
archive, so
Yes.
send the kids a link or whatever. if
Yeah,
they want,
yeah.
So like, it'll be on
I think
there.
that's what I probably forgot to do is tell them that it was up. But that's cool.
Oh god, yeah, if you tell them.
Yeah.
a lot more bits.
Yeah. Well, I told the first batch of kids. But yeah, the second one. Right, let's Right, we're going to start in 2 minutes.
Yes, great. So you should take a screenshot of
Be really well
Should I
recorded.
just kind of
yeah, I thought we would put it in. Very beautiful. My comfort was censored. Great, thank you, thank you. Good, go see with the screen. We cannot see.
Almost there. Who's going to set that?
What are you doing again, right?
Okay. Shall we get going? Just press start.
Press start.
Hang on, one sec.
Gossip update later. Wait.
Oh, yay!
Oh wow, okay. It's okay if I go.
Yeah, please do.
Are you still setting up or?
We're pretty much about to go, so yeah.
Okay, but I'll
Oh yeah, grab coffee. Get them coffee and then we'll start.
Yeah, I saw. Well, I mean, I can hear his voice.
Yeah, they voice now. Oh, that's it. That you know you reach certain peak when you're like, oh, I know. Oh no, it's fine. I thought it said it'd gone up.
We should do like an online viewing. Yeah, you go.
Yeah, and weird coincidence. Happy, like, so friends in Cambridge, I was at hello, is it time? The curator and the night right now. It's like,
Yeah.
no, she, I met her in Entangled, it's just in Singapore.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
This week.
There's many. I want to clarify what we're talking about.
I mean, I was kind of thinking I don't know how much I think that the one was like, okay, and yeah. But was it there or was it no, okay. I'm there for the other
Should I sit here?
Yeah, sit here.
I'm really tired.
How are you?
Yeah,
Like busy.
Thanks for coming. Yeah, it is. Okay, I think we're ready to start. So, Vanessa, in fact, I'm just going to give a little welcome quickly from behind the camera to our audience. And yeah, thanks very much for coming. I'm going to leave most of the introducing to Vanessa, But yeah, just thanks very much for coming along, and we're really fortunate to be joined by a really exciting panel, and Vanessa Murrell, who's going to be chairing the conversation today. So I'll hand over to Vanessa to introduce herself and the event.
Perfect. Well, I'm going to say thank you for coming as well. This talk coincides with the CypherBILLBOARD closing of the Bounds online exhibition, which is currently on at Skelf's website. And it also coincides with the closing of the program, of the Bounds program here in Bounds Green. And the talk is going to explore elements of resistance, complicity, and collaboration within arts collectives. And yeah, as Holly kindly said, I'm going to introduce the speakers. So we've got CypherBILLBOARD, which is a project run by artists Holly Graham, Erin Hughes, which is here, and Amba Sayal Bennett. The project seeks to commission responsive site-specific artworks for a billboard space here in Bounds Green. The site hopes to challenge conventions of display, providing an alternative space for developing new work, holding its own rules and limitations, as well as freedoms and extensions, which we'll talk about later on. And then we've got Claire from Skelf. Skelf is a virtual project space, accessible to anyone everywhere. Existing entirely online since 2016, they've presented work by over 50 artists and writers. From 2019, they launched a new series of quarterly group exhibitions, each presented by a different guest curator. So Bounds is the third exhibition in this program, and you were recently awarded public funding through the Arts Council. And behind me we've got Soft Wall Studs, which are a collaborative project in Singapore. It involves several artists, writers, filmmakers, art workers, and researchers. Its projects include exhibition, acts of amplification, hosting, fugitivity, counter-rhythm generation, support, resource gathering, research, writing, deterrent, game making, teaching, collaboration, and many more. And my name is Vanessa. I run the online platform That's Eagle Arts, and we founded it, well, me and my partner Martin Mayorga founded it in 2017. It's an online platform that supports emerging artists through interviews, studio visits, blog, online curation as well as offline curation, mostly in non-exhibition spaces. And yeah, it would be lovely if you guys can introduce yourselves individually as well and your presentations.
Okay, great. So shall I start? So I'll talk a little bit about CypherBILLBOARD, how we started, and we'll also show a few slides of some different adverts that we've seen across London, which sort of sparked some thinking around CypherBILLBOARD. So we started in 2017, myself, Holly and Amber, and we'd worked together previously on a project in Berlin. When Amber was doing her PhD, the five of us all had this group show in Berlin, sort of inspired by some of the research that Amber was doing on her PhD at the time. So after we'd worked together on that project, and we also, that exhibition travelled to London, and Holly managed to get access to this billboard in Bounds Green. Holly then invited myself and Amber, who were both based in London as well, to come on board with the project and sort of think about how we can use this site to explore and kind of expand not just the billboard itself. So it really sparked a lot of discussions that we had at the beginning. And so what we decided to do is to have a programme where we would invite artists to make a site-specific artwork for the billboard, and each artist was also invited to organise a corresponding event that ran concurrently to the opening of their billboard. And yeah, I think, what should I say next? Yeah, I think what started out as a project which we were quite loosely thinking about sort of billboards in general and advertisements in general, which we'll go through a few slides in a minute. Then over the following 2 years of the project, we've really become a lot more grounded in the site specificity of Bounds Green itself, and really involving a lot of local spaces, cafes, different local kind of places that have hosted different events. So for instance, today we're here at Hot Milk Cafe in Bounds Green, which we've had many of our meetings at, and they've been really generous letting us hosting the event here. So I'm just going to run through a few billboards that I noticed when I first moved to London in 2016, because having lived in Berlin for the previous 4 years, coming to London and seeing all of these different billboards, it really struck a chord with how these kind of public advertisements really are quite telling of the total vibe of a city. So some of the billboards I really picked up on in London were, I suddenly saw a lot of billboards for, or advertisements for mattresses. And sort of jumping to a little bit later on. So this billboard as well, this advertisement which has been running for about 4 or 5 years. I don't know if anyone here has seen this. Are you tired of being tired? And I was just thinking, there's a lot of adverts for mattresses, energy drinks, and natural energy pills, because basically everyone in London is exhausted. And this advert in particular, it's been running so long. There's even this Reddit, there's quite a few posts of people saying, is anyone else tired of seeing this advert about being tired of being tired? Because it's just been going on for so long. And I think it's just, very telling of the city in terms of it's your fault if you're tired. You can then buy something to kind of alleviate it. And everyone's probably working ridiculously hard. So I thought that really made a huge impression on me. And then we can go to the images of Rio as well. Just another example of billboards in a city. So this is in Rio, where they used to have an incredible amount of billboards. And then a new mayor came in and decided to get rid of and tidy up the city, so get rid of loads of these billboards across the city. And there's just this huge difference on the streets, as you can see, and how much that it actually, by taking down these billboards, they realised that it was actually covering up a lot of things that people didn't realise existed in the city. So, for instance, some of the billboards would actually be physically supporting some houses, and some places where people were living were kind of covered up by the billboards, and then they kind of got exposed afterwards. So it kind of, to our CypherBILLBOARD beginnings and discussions, it's in this text by Nicholas Helmgravers. Thanks. I love this text that we commissioned for the latest CypherBILLBOARD publication, and he's got a nice sort of some historical references of billboards within contemporary art, and one that I'm just going to pull out for now, which leads on to the later discussion, is one example is Public Access, where they had, it was a group collective, and they had access to a commercial billboard, and I think the commercial billboard was called something, I can't remember the name of it, but basically it was an electronic billboard, so they would have these artworks interspliced with the artwork, with the artworks would be advertisements. So there came a point in the project where one of the artist's artworks were saying words like, oh thanks Holly. Oh yeah, so cheat, hate, kill, lie, rage, rape, sell, starve, steal, win. And this 20-second message, repeated every 7 minutes, was immediately followed by an ad for a McDonald's. McDonald's. So the hamburger company threatened to remove their advertising from the Pixel board. Public Access was called in to defend the artistic merit of Les Levine's project, which was the artist's work. To their credit, Electromedia, which was the electronic billboard that they were working with, accepted the collective argument, and Levine's injunctions remained on view. McDonald's response was that they withdrew their adverts, making Electromedia wary of the whole project. A month later, Lynn Fernie's sign, Lesbians Fly Air Canada / Private Desires Public Sins, was censored by Electromedia, which reasoned that the airline was a potential client. The display cost them more advertising revenue. So Public Access mediated a solution where Fernie substituted graphics rendering the phrase Air Canada unreadable. So basically they were kind of beholden to these corporate capitalist interests. And one thing that I'm really proud about with CypherBILLBOARD, and think we're really, really fortunate, is that we're not so beholden to sort of that kind of capitalist restrictions because of the very unique setup we have with the billboard. So yeah, those are a few examples of other billboards, and please check out our CypherBILLBOARD website so you can see the previous events and artists we've been working with. Come on. Okay. Shall I tell you about Skelf?
For sure.
Sure. So Skelf is an online project space, and I describe it as project space rather than a gallery because I try and think of it as a place where artists can try things and hopefully work in a different way to how they might normally work, rather than somewhere that you, I guess, replicate something that exists in the real world. So it's important to me that, Skelf's a website, it's skelf.org.uk, so it doesn't physically exist anywhere, and it's for but it hosts exhibitions and it hosts regular projects on there, which I aim to give kind of the same weight and precedence as physical spaces. But there were kind of monthly solo projects, new projects every 3 months. And what I'm doing for this series of projects is inviting a different curator each time to invite a whole bunch of artists themselves. So rather than it being kind of 12 artists a year, hopefully this means I'm having kind of 50 artists a year and discovering a lot of new artists that perhaps I've not come across before, or opening up what potential for the site is. So accompanying the project, since we've had funding, is podcast done by Mark Belgium, who's over there. It's kind of given us scope to kind of do various extra things with the project than we've otherwise done. So the current project is by CypherBILLBOARD, and they curated it, and there's kind of it's I would say adjacent to the project that's on the physical billboard that's just around the corner. So what I've been quite interested in trying to do with this Skelf site is to for it not to be documentation. So it's not maybe somebody makes paintings and then we photograph them and then we put them online. I'm not trying to replace that kind of physical experience of going to see something. It's about finding a new space and something else that happens, and hopefully extending the reach of the project, of artworks and projects. So I guess the little tagline that Vanessa mentioned that we have about being accessible to everyone, I guess I'm thinking about accessibility in terms of finances firstly, that it's, it can be, you don't have to spend money to go there, you don't have to, it's not about where you live, you can live somewhere very remotely and hopefully see some high quality contemporary art. You can don't have to also, you can be quite time poor, you can look at it on your phone, on the bus, you can listen to the podcast in the middle of the night or on the way to work or what have you. So it's kind of about maybe bringing contemporary art that traditionally you might have to go and see in London on a Saturday afternoon into the kind of periphery spaces of day-to-day life. Yeah, sorry.
It would be lovely to hear a bit more about softball studs as well.
Okay, is it our turn?
Yes.
Um,
Over to you guys.
do you have our slides, Holly?
I do. Well, did you want to do a
If you've
screen
got
share
our
or do you want me
slides.
to slide for you?
Maybe if you show our slides it would be better because
Yeah.
maybe a screen share would be like really tiny.
Yeah. Okay.
So if you pull up our slides, we could look at the first one. So if that's on, I'm going to. Okay. So Skelf, Luca, and Kim, we're kind of representing our group or platform, Softball Steps. We began about in 2016 in Singapore, and it started off quite informally. We were like, we wanted to have space together to be able to gather and host projects, and basically just to have like a place to see what could happen out of it. So in our context of Singapore, a lot of art spaces, at least at the time when we started, it was still quite institutional or connected to government-funded programs, and so a lot of us don't really have a culture of directing our own space. So there's also the situation when we want to make a kind of independent project or event, the issue of having a space to do it or a venue is always quite a big thing. So I think when we started, that was sort of the atmosphere that we were in. And then it sort of, once we had the space that we found that became Superballs, a lot of things just snowballed one after another. So maybe you can go to the second slide. If you went onto our Instagram, you would be able to see just kind of selection of the events that have been hosted and carried out over the last few years. So there's quite a variety of them. Surely one. There is film screening programs, discussions, reading groups, as well as maybe not so much exhibitions, but times when the space hosts an artist's installation of work or so do you think?
Or in the case of like a young artist named Diva, sometimes it's like the space becomes a way that allows for like a second airing or certain things to clarify. But I think above all, it's also a sense that I guess our relationship to institutions and authority is quite interesting. There is very much a sense, at least I feel, within Singapore, especially with its accelerated growth and the accelerated pace at which the art scene has been developed in a very centralized way. It affects how you approach an idea of authority. And I think it was important for me to get a sense of like self-authorship, and that you didn't necessarily have to cut to or enter a already legitimate space, of which there's a very clear process of, in order to just maybe experiment a project or air it out. Because sometimes the spaces can also be very prohibitive. Your regulations around like showing, you have to apply for sometimes certain permits. And because of the way the stakeholders involved in those institutions, also means that some things are just not of their interest. And sometimes things get censored. So the space was important for us to grow our own practices, but also do it with others. And for me, at least, there's a sense that a desire to sort of shift cultural modes in that way. Like doing it with others meant that there was more amplification, and that just a more effective shifting in terms of like norms and things people were used to seeing. Because you could do an exhibition and sometimes it'd be like shouting in a void, but to do a gesture where like you carve out space and consistently do things, even things people didn't really understand all the time, felt significant.
I guess it's also it was also a way of creating a site for alternative framing, alternative voicing. I guess if we run through some of our other sites, you would see samples of some of the events. If you look at slide 3, that is a picture from after one of the film screenings, which was part of the artist Diva Agar's project, The Soul Lounge. So, as part of the project, the Lizzie Borden's film was screened, and then there was discussion after that, and that's a format that has kind of persisted for a while. I'm not sure if Kim would like to speak a little bit more about the film screen or the history of STEMs.
I would actually like to more move into the areas of, I mean, thinking about also maybe across disciplines. I think also what brought a lot of us together is the fact that we all exist in multiple spheres and not limited to any particular disciplinary, artistic discipline or whatsoever. And so I think a lot of the explorations that we also took in the space was one that was never confined in any form of perhaps disciplinary or I mean, personally, I would like to see it as a sort of very disciplined sorts, right? I mean, in multiple ways, beyond practice, but also perhaps in how we also navigate or negotiate with authority, so to say. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I
So
wanted
the
to.
fourth slide is October, which who would like to speak about that? If we go to slide 4, who wants to summarize October as a sample of things that happened?
So the beautiful visual was concocted by Payne. And in October was our step of interest to re-examine the aftermath and afterlives of revolutions. That's why you have like Zeno and then October thinking, I mean, in reference to the October Revolution, but all the other cascading events afterward. So we had a sort of relay where artists were giving like lectures on guerrilla warfare or doing performances out on the road, and it sort of blended and flowed among themselves. And I feel like it's kind of like typical of the kind of events you get there. Like people will turn out and you don't really know what's going to happen, but we just like throw it at them, and people have to sort of stay and reorient themselves along the way. Yeah, I think I'll just leave it there. Can you add anything?
I think also, I guess one of the considerations aside from this course or the disciplinary boards that we had to maybe potentially adopt is also one play, I guess, and how we play off one another and our own orientations and investments and how it also results into these very particular sort of sequencing of events into our programs or into the events that we hold itself. Also to try to think about how they could inform each other or one another in some senses. Also, in some ways, how we organize amongst ourselves, right? As I think we've mentioned before, within our own personal capacities, the notion of shadowing, how that in itself also, is an act of studies, an act of learning, and how most of our endeavors are also one of our own explorations and perhaps expansions.
Yeah, being companionic to others, other labors, sort of that porosity, I think, allows us to grow our extensions. I think for me, it's politically important and personally important for that to happen.
Thank you so much. I think maybe if we pause it there, and I'm going to hand back over to Vanessa, but I'll leave the slides in case there's anything that seems of relevance. I'm also going to turn you guys around so you can see everybody, and I'm going to go and join everyone over
Okay.
there.
All right.
Hopefully without
Thank you.
disconnecting.
Hello.
thank you all for your introductions. I guess going back to the conversation, and I wanted to start with like the title of the conversation itself, which is titled "To Be So Entangled: Resistance, Complicity, and Collaboration." And with Softwell's description of what they are, it was very difficult to find online what they actually do, and I guess that's in part due to the censorship that they were talking about, and I guess we'll get there in a while. But I read that you define yourselves as a complex entanglement, and I thought that was quite interesting considering that the talk is titled "To Be Entangled." So I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit about that entanglement, that complex entanglement that you are. What's the pillars of these entanglements?
I didn't catch the last sentence.
So,
What was that last sentence?
I mean, I guess it's quite interesting that you define yourself as a complex entanglement, rather than, like an online platform or, a gallery space or, project space. Can you tell us more about your definition of, like, being a complex entanglement?
I think that, at least to tell on what we were talking about earlier, moves in that direction. I think first and foremost, maybe it's not obvious what we do together, because a lot of what we do together is really the fact that we are together, making things, thinking together, none of which are always visible. I would say that Softwell Studs as a project isn't necessarily always product oriented, which means it doesn't always move towards like, oh, we're all going to do this like material production together, we're always going to do an exhibition. Oftentimes it's an awareness of people coming from very different places with certain affinities, wanting, sort of aiming for a similar horizon, and that horizon often is shaded in like decoloniality, anti-fascism, anti-capitalism, and I think it's like finding places along the way that help ourselves in our individual projects and as a kind of group that is loosely networked together.
So going back to that idea of capitalism, I want to kind of ask all of you, because all of your projects are self-sufficient, how do you find the balance between being self-sufficient and having a voice in the wider structures of the art world?
I think, I don't know, that question of self-sufficiency is quite a tricky one, because how self-sufficient are you ever? I guess that's the question of this whole whole talk. But so we initially, I guess in terms of like funding, we started off the project by pooling, so myself, Erin and Amber, by pooling some money that we'd earned from selling some work in a group show. And it was just, that as like the kind of seed funding. So I guess it was money out of our own pockets really. And then went on to do like a couple of fundraisers and bits. For this run, we managed to get some Arts Council funding to support production and to be able to sort of pay the artists we were inviting small fees really. And I guess like alongside that, there's like the relationship we have with the site owner. So we're able to use the site because of like essentially a friendship. So the person who owns the site is the father of one of my very good friends, who's an artist turned property developer, and who like happened to buy some land that had this billboard on it when he wanted to develop some houses. So it's like this complex sort of layering of stuff, and without his sort of support, we wouldn't have the space at all. And I guess that all ties into this idea of like self-sufficiency. It's like we're not really self-sufficient at all. It's very much like based on these sort of contingent circumstances and.
Because I'm aware that you, as a means of being self-sufficient, you also accept advertisements on your billboard when it's not in use as an artwork.
Yeah, so we actually
That's an idea.
haven't yet. But it is a hope and an idea, and it's something that we were initially, or at least I definitely was really resistant to this idea of advertising on this kind of quite sacred art space that we decided that the space was. But actually, after like thinking about it quite a bit, it made total sense that we would use our resources to kind of become a bit more self-sufficient. So with, you know, the idea in mind that actually it's incredibly precarious running a project like this, and that applying for funding, like funding's never guaranteed. That actually
I'm sure
if we've got,
Claire can say a bit more about that in terms of the funding, because Skelf has just received funding, right?
Since the end of last year.
Yeah.
So we've got 2 years of funding from the Arts Council, but I think it's the same as what you were saying, that you kind of, I guess initially I set up Skelf with the idea of, well, the kind of impossible idea that it would be separate from money, and it would be something that I could run for free essentially, and that it would exist in a kind of alternative space to the commercial art world, and that it could be something that supported artists by providing a platform and a deadline and an audience, but not actually, there was no budget, and it could kind of exist separately. But obviously, as we probably will unpack as we go on, that's a complete fallacy, because the impact is your time. I spend a lot of time working on it for free, and it sort of becomes this thing that then someone has to pay for somewhere. And I thought there was an interesting point on your the podcast that accompanies the CypherBILLBOARD show, where you're talking about, well, we could do it almost for free, but then it got to a point where we were trying to hang a billboard up a ladder, and it was dangerous, and we were like, right, okay, so what's the cost of this? And if that's
Material cost.
it's either a material cost, it's your safety, or it's your time, or there's always a cost somewhere. Like your, the friend that has given you the billboard, you can always say, oh well, they could be earning this, that, and the other by advertising. There's always kind of if it's not a direct cost, it's a cost that's been lost. The hours that I spent building the site, I could be working and earning money, and so that there's always it's impossible to have something separate from money. But
in your case, Softball Studs, I'm aware that you've sold T-shirts and all sorts of things to be able to fundraise your projects. I don't know if you want to speak a bit more about how you're managing to raise money.
Well, those were our hopeful supplementary methods, but the fact is, like what Holly was saying earlier, the co-founders and the members actually still pay for the space and the rental and the monthly expenses mostly out of our own personal money. So yeah, everybody has other jobs, and we're still maintaining our physical site and the ongoing activity with our own funds. So sometimes we do have like some supplementary, voluntary donations by way of drinks during events or by the T-shirts. But yes, it's still largely resting on all our personal capabilities. Sometimes for specific projects, we have applied for and received state funding, but those do come with the T&C of receiving funding, and that is not suitable for everything. So I think we all also agreed not to try to apply for a more long-term kind of state funding as a way to also maintain that flexibility with what we do and who we work with, because we would otherwise also, maybe we might restrict ourselves, or we might be restricted by some terms of receiving state funding.
So I'm wondering,
Yes.
what model of sustainability would you all propose as an ideal model?
Mm-hmm.
wow, that's such a good question.
Didn't hear any.
didn't hear.
Do you want to repeat the question?
Yeah.
No.
So what model of sustainability would you propose for a project such as yours?
I think right now, within the context that we're working in, I think it's interesting not to deny the power of the market and to somehow try and work with it in a way that it works for us rather than us working for it somehow. So the idea that a billboard is normally used for such capitalist purposes, but we're somehow we're taking that framework and doing something where it makes it work for us rather than us spending our time working for the billboard.
And that's something I also wanted to ask you. Do you think that the billboard can be seen or read as an advertisement in itself because of the of the framework where it's positioned? And how do you push against that?
What I was interested in is that a lot of the feedback we've had from local people seeing the billboard physically is that they very much say that it seems separate from advertising. So they can tell that it's not an advertisement, even if some of the billboards have played with adverts and sort of, use that kind of commercial aesthetic within the work. But I'd say, rather than kind of working against these corporate interests, it's somehow managing to find a way that it works with moments where you can work with it where it's working for you rather than the other way around.
I think it's a really tricky thing, and like definitely with the idea of like advertising on this like traditionally advertising space, one of the things that like I feel like helped us to sort of reconcile the idea of that being potentially quite a good and useful, sustainable model in terms of feeding the project is that actually we have quite a lot of power in that respect of like knowing to some extent where the money's coming from. So like we could invite or offer out that opportunity to like local businesses or locally based organisations to be able to advertise kind of whatever their services are, as opposed to being very aware that like a lot of the money circulating within the art world is incredibly sort of like dirty.
There's a transparency to that, isn't there? Like you were saying, of kind of almost you do one advert and it pays for one artwork, and there's kind of, I guess, when you're sort of saying what might be an ideal model of a sustainable thing, obviously it's not entirely sustainable to be entirely separate from any commercial practice. But then if you are then reliant on public funding or another kind of funding, which, the funding we have has the word National Lottery in it, and it's sort of like it comes through some circuitous route that you can tell, well, it's connected to gambling, or, there's kind of a lot of, there's always patronage, someone somewhere's paid for it. And I guess a sort of an ideal model might be somewhere where there is this direct transparency of, we've sold this and it's made this, or there's kind of, perhaps it's not possible to exist separately from the finances, but something that kind of shows it's supporting, or
And also a really interesting thing that I found actually through the podcast was that you mentioned how relevant like your billboard and the advertisement and how that's the financial aspect of that was linked to Skelf's context being in a website, in the online realm. And I don't know if you can speak a bit more about those connections between the commerciality between advertisements and websites.
Well, I guess there's something about the website that it's not limited in its reach. It potentially could reach anybody and spread and be sort of completely transferable. So the billboard here, it was kind of interesting to work with this project because it was site specific, it's locally based, it's kind of in this place, whereas you can track your visitors to the website and you can see, somebody's looked at this from Australia, and the concept of Bounds Green or what might be a local space there will mean nothing, and I don't know, I was kind of thinking of if you have an advert for a local business on your site, which then funds a piece of artwork which might reach somebody in another country, there's a kind of lovely, I don't know, sense of, it's like an advert, isn't it? But it's
I guess, we were thinking as well a bit about how, like when we were thinking about doing this second run of the project, and Claire had been in touch with me about potentially curating something for Skelf, and we were talking about like these different sort of overlaps between very different but spaces or sites that have these like overlaps of sort of like being very public, but also having this like other side of actually being often, usually, generally private spaces, privatised spaces, and very commercial, and like that, the fact that you have like these billboards on private land or privately owned billboards in public space operating in this kind of semi-democratic or seemingly democratic way, and then similarly in online space, similarly but differently, in online space where a lot of the space feels very much like for all, and it is a very democratic space. Everyone can have a stake in it and like have an input, but at the same time, there's like often all of your input is being used for like financial gain, for like data mining, so that they can sell stuff to you again. So like these, I guess we were like thinking about like this nuances between, yeah, these quite slippery publics and privates, yeah.
I'm interested in your views of all stats because your projects are very public as well, but you're in a context where there's a lot of censorship in Singapore, and you cannot publish certain things on your website. There's no documentation, and there's this also element of public and private.
I don't think we felt so much censorship on our website or our social media platforms as yet. But that's also because we're not an institution. Like, for example, if you go on our Facebook page, we have is aromatherapy still on the Facebook page? So it's more like it's a social community, and it's a lot of word of mouth, and people get to know us by and by, and that helps us kind of bypass maybe being, having to worry so much about official censorships. I was thinking about, should we anything else you want to comment about the censorship groups before we talk about our own response to the sustainability?
I think part of sustainability, I think like it goes back to the purposes of the space, and because a lot of what the space set out to do was, I think, especially to generate affinity between the persons in my other life, like not me, and to kind of entry. Sustainability also means sustaining those networks, and that can happen in many different ways. I think censorship in Singapore is like a funny question. The state is sophisticated, like in a really scary way, that it kind of conditions you to maybe not think of some things. I think for us, we're aware that there's a sensitive topic, we do closed door events, but it still happens in this space, and so like having it in that one space of gathers like a whole archive of things that have happened, and I think that's how we go about it.
I think in that sense, the space has also been maybe a place where our friends or our community also know that they could possibly feel, a little bit more flexible or free to explore certain things.
Yeah.
It's also because of that, and I feel like it kind of all works together. The fact that this sort of organic collectivity that we've been exploring the space so far makes it so much about, the kind of person-to-person connections and networks that blur a lot of boundaries all the time. So that itself helps to make things maybe a bit harder to pin down. In that sense.
When you're talking about these personal connections and how what you're doing is known from person to person, but I'm wondering how difficult is it to access your platform if you don't know if you don't know about it? Like, do you announce it to other people that are not in your networks?
I think we have an open Facebook page and Instagram account. Neither of them are private. And I think as our local scene is still it's relatively small and very connected, it just ends up mostly a word of mouth thing. And it's still that way. I don't think we try to actually expand our audience specifically, except for maybe I'm thinking of certain workshops where we've tried to call out a bit more broadly.
Yeah, because sometimes you get people, I think people are more adventurous than we can credit for. And because the space is so diverse, you get people who would just turn up for film screenings, and you would not expect them to do that, but then we've gone as much as 50 people for screenings consistently, or people who are really interested in design and surveillance, and they just turn up. For us, I think we sort of waited out across the need to retain a certain level of opacity, but it's also a kind of playful opacity. That's what's interesting for us. It sort of outweighs the need to be super, transparent and obvious about what we're doing. And I think in the first place, the nature of those events, things just sort of often very much emerge within the event. We don't like to be too prescriptive as what any one thing is. And in Singapore especially, that is very much the tone of most cultural offerings, institutions, and we just sort of go hard in the opposite direction. But information about us is readily available, and we're often around and we talk to a lot of people about these things.
Amazing, thank you. And we're going back to what's happening here in London with the Bounce exhibition and the Billboard site. How much does the location inform the works on the billboard?
That's really interesting. I think Erin touched on it at the beginning. I think about some of that quite a bit because I'm also involved in a project space in South London in Croydon called Turf Projects, and in that space, everyone who works for Turf either lives in Croydon or has lived in Croydon, has a very direct connection to the area, and very intentionally so. And it's we have a lot of conversations about that being part of us being sort of rooted in the community and of the community and having a real stake in it. Whereas quite differently with the CypherBILLBOARD project, neither myself, Erin or Amber are from Bounds Green or live in Bounds Green. Yeah, that's cool. And the only reason that we're here and that the project is here is circumstantial, basically, is because this billboard was presented to us as an opportunity to do something. But as the project's kind of gone on, what we've always tried to do, I should say, is to kind of forge connections with people living and working locally. So through kind of workshops and events, whenever we've had those events, we try to maybe do them in local businesses or local organisations. So we've done workshops in schools, local youth groups. With, like Erin mentioned, we've got this event in the cafe, we've done an event in the pub. So we kind of getting to know people that way. And something amazing that's emerged from, I guess, the project and our involvement here is a real friendship with the neighbours. And so, so we've hosted a couple of events now in their house, and that's literally next to the billboard site, and that's a sort of relationship that's grown out of us just sort of like being here and hanging out. And so in that respect, the project is started to take on, it started to feel very important that we're here, as opposed to at the beginning where it felt quite potentially very movable. Yeah. And it still has the potential to be quite itinerant in some ways, but it would take on quite a different character, I think.
I guess that links very well with the Skelf exhibition at the moment, which is titled Bounds, and it offers a map of the location.
Yeah.
So it seems like a pivotal moment for you and for the location. And I don't know if you want to tell us more about that exhibition currently at Skelf.
Sure. Well, I mean, I guess you guys are probably the best person to talk about, but I guess there's somewhere between
fictional space and a real space. It's kind of, which is, I guess, a thread that's run through this exhibition, but also the Skelf idea of an online space at all. I mean, the thing that appeals to me about the internet, and I think is very democratic about the internet, is that it's got this limitless space. It's, you know, you can build as much on there as you are able to, and the content is, you can just keep putting more and more and more, and it can go on and on and on and expand, and which was what was initially refreshing to me about the space, was that I was kind of trying to curate physical things and put on shows, and there was never a space. I could never find someone that would lend me a wall or a room, or there was always a cost attached to that, and there's overheads and there's, you know, limits there. But I could do some basic coding, and I was like, here is a platform where potentially you can just put as much as you can learn how to do online. So that's why it's been quite interesting in working with somewhere that is a project that's so tied up with a physical place. And this map, which is, you know, it's of the area, but it's not the projects. They're kind of, if you visit the site, you know, there's a map and there's these little icons, and each of the artists has an icon, and you can kind of experience their artwork where the icons are based. But they're not, it's not like Google Maps. It's not a direct, you click here and this is exactly what you'll find. It's kind of, it moves into this fictional realm of artworks in space, and I think there will be very few visitors who are to the site that are directly familiar with the area and the site, and it's probably a very different audience to the ones that have seen Billboard.
Yeah, and I think it's something also that informed our collaboration with Skelf as well. I mean, with Softball Studs, because we chatted to both Luca and Wei Xin previously about potentially at some point doing some form of collaboration or crossover or exchange, and we hadn't managed to visualise exactly what form that would take. But we talked about the possibility of something virtual, or could you send a digital file and then the other group kind of install it somehow, and so the Billboard and Skelf provided like this opportunity to literally do that, to do something that really expanded sort of networks and audiences and relationships and ways of working and making or curating or installing. So that was quite exciting. But also Erin was saying something a bit earlier, which maybe again about like responses to space and location in terms of the artworks themselves, and
about the sustainability.
yeah,
About
sustainability, and also about like Dan's work being sort of more tied to the area. But
yeah,
both of those.
So yeah, there's been a couple of the artists that have wanted to respond site specifically to Bounds Green, and with Jakob and Eilish's work was looking at local advertisements in the space and using sections of words from local words, signage, and using those words and kind of making them into some kind of poetry as an offering to Bounds Green as a kind of sweetness. And also Dan Mitchell was one of the artists that really tackled Bounds Green as a subject. And in discussions with him, it was quite interesting that he was very much thinking of Bounds Green as quite lacking in culture generally. And I mean, since we've been there for 2 years, we were always quite defensive of like, no, Bounds Green has got some things going on, but he did point out to us that we would only be here if we had this project. So, and also what came out of this research is that Bounds Green itself is historically a layover place where tradespeople would come to Bounds Green to stay just one night while they worked. They exchanged something in the city and then they'd go back to where they actually lived. So Bounds Green became a very transient place where people would just stay for one night. So it never really developed as much culturally as other parts of London. So that was something that Dan was really interested in, kind of poking fun at in a way. And so he dressed up as R.D. Lang and gave a kind of psychological hypnotherapy session to Bounds Green, trying to kind of hypnotise the people of Bounds Green into getting more cultural. So it was a very tongue-in-cheek kind of approach to context of Bounds Green.
Yeah, it's something we like really just talked about a lot. It like provoked a lot of conversation kind of between ourselves as the curators, as the sort of like people bringing this work to this specific site, and thinking as well about our own positions, all not actually being from here, and what it means to sort of like whether we were kind of trying to figure out, I guess, whether it was like a wider critique of like culture and people's sort of engagement with it, or whether it was like very targeted on, which we felt could be quite problematic. But yeah, it's been a really interesting project in terms of like just seeing how people respond to the site in very different ways, like from that sort of like very specific approach to something that's like a more broad engagement, maybe with advertising imagery or.
Yeah, it makes a kind of quite a, I guess, a mockery of the funding process. If you're applying for funding, a lot of it is about proving the audience that you're going to reach. So how many people are you going to share the work with, and you kind of get more points if you reach people who wouldn't otherwise be interested in art. So if you kind of if you're showing an exhibition to the same old people that go to everything, it's not of particular interest. Whereas if you're kind of reaching new audiences, then brilliant, here's some funding. Whereas when you have that billboard, it's at a road junction, so you're getting hundreds of people every hour pass by and have this incidental engagement with it, which in theory would score very highly on a sort of funding application. Whereas are they having this kind of engaged response with it, or like how do we value?
Well, that's something that links back to the public and the private spaces, and also something that you were talking about in the podcast about the project being in a public space, and that people just encounter it, as you mentioned, just walking past it. But in your case, in Skelf, people access it not by coincidence.
You have to seek it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I also wanted to ask you guys from Sophos Studs, because you were invited to make an artwork as part of the CypherBILLBOARD program. So it would be lovely to know a bit more about the piece that you made and how it merged at the advertising culture with wellness and spirituality. And
Did you guys hear that?
I think yes.
Well, yeah. Shall we answer the question?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So, yeah, just thinking along that thread, I was just thinking about how, in a sense, making this project was also kind of our way to really get to know Cypher and Skelf a bit more as well, and make this together. So when we were thinking about that framework of advertising which the Billboard site offered, we were thinking a lot about the kind of like digital businesses, the commercialization of social media platforms like Instagram, and also about the idea of like desires and deities. Basically, the way people's desires are outsourced, or and with the Godex, what we wanted to make was this ambiguous kind of either deity or commercial service, who knows, that would combine a few of the different threads of influence we were gathering on looking at this work. So there's a few sort of cheeky references, like the theme of the orchid, which was, a very, very popular flower exported all over the world during our kind of imperial period under British colonization. And the symbol of the orchid is like an ultimate exotic ornamental plant, which Singapore itself also adopted by choosing the orchid as our national flower. So there's this kind of playful reference to the figure of the orchid in that image of this unknown digital deity, as well as I'm just thinking about the the image of the deity and breaking it down to look at the different threats we have. And another element that was quite present there was the surveillance cameras, as we're living in an increasingly surveilled environment in Singapore, especially in the locale where our studio is located. It's kind of been the focus of increasing surveillance, especially. So this other threat was also brought into it. Do you guys have other comments?
I think we were also interested in having a significant portion of the artwork not just be billboard, and that translated into the Instagram account. Initially, also WhatsApp account, or like one of those weird numbers you would call up and maybe like say what you wanted, your desires, and all that. And that's not a new form. You're always going to want like a tarot reading or like a fortune reading. But more recently, I think we've noticed an emergence of a lot of social media accounts that ranging from influencers to like maybe cultists or like astrology apps and astrology persons really try to cultivate that sort of a space of like vulnerability and sharing and like wishing. And for me, that was an interesting way to enter into like a commercial space. Yeah.
I think in a sense that's a very like contemporary facet of the trend, but at the same time it's also a very, very present reality in Singapore. A lot of the main religions are basically, also about this transaction between the believers and the institution of the religion. And before, apart from social media platforms, it's a very present, this idea of praying or desire or sending up your desires to an unknown higher force is one that is very physically present in our environment as well. A lot of offerings and a lot of rites and rituals, festivals throughout the year where people really, really harp on the idea of seeking either divine or supernatural fulfillment of your wishes.
And that links really well with your research on wellness and tired of being tired. And this kind of like, do you think the audience located here engaged with, a work that comes from Singapore and all of the ideas that she's saying about their context? Do you think that it was relatable in these contexts?
I think I've been thinking a lot, even just now when we're talking about it, but also previously about, I guess, like layers of the work and opacity to some degree as well. So I feel like a lot of the poster works, like, people do encounter them sometimes really fleetingly in their car driving past, sometimes on a daily basis as they're walking by. Very few people, but some, do come specifically to see it. And so the levels of like engagement with the work will be different on all of those encounters. But I think we're really, really keen to sort of like do the accompanying events that we have, and also in this particular run with the work with the Skelf site, which really like enables people to be able to sort of like access the work in a bit more depth maybe, or our hope for it was that it would draw out conversations within the work. And so I guess, people engage with it on different levels. And I think one thing that has been like interesting to note or think about is like actually which audiences you're sort of like speaking to or having a conversation with. So like, for example, with the events that we tend to hold, although we like invite the neighbours, a couple might come, and we've made really good friends with some of the neighbours on site. But a lot of the time, it's really our existing networks and like our friends and other artists we know. But then, the online spaces allow hopefully an extended engagement. So like the Instagram and like your guys' Instagram account and hopefully the website, if people are curious and interested, they might go there and like be able to sort of like, I don't know.
I think that's quite exciting, and what is
a lovely element of this idea of a kind of non-commercial art space, which Vanessa mentioned and is something I think we've all been thinking about. Maybe it's not possible to entirely exist separate from money, and that's kind of an impossible dream. But this idea that you can engage in all these other periphery parts of people's lives, and we were discussing earlier, not being able to get out to see as much art as you would like to see, but this experience of I saw an image of it on Instagram, and I saw or I looked at it online, or I did this and I did this, and perhaps that is not necessarily a lower form of engagement. We're kind of brought up with this hierarchical idea that you must go to the museum and stand in front of the painting and have this one-on-one engagement with art in a very pure way, and you have this kind of emotional experience with it, and that is lovely when you can do it, but it's not always possible and not kind of practical in our lives often. So this kind of, but yet we spend so much time on our phones, and we spend all this time online and in this virtual world, and if that's not seen as kind of less valuable time somehow to engage with art, you can, whether you see an artwork in passing as you're driving past, or scrolling, or however, it's still a kind of valid experience.
So what do you think are the benefits of your own way of doing things being online, and what do you think are the disadvantages of it?
I mean, the benefits, I guess, a lot of the things I mentioned about accessibility and freedom in terms of, people can look at it wherever they are, and it's kind of financially, it doesn't have these overheads and things. I think disadvantages, well, it's reliant on a sort of technical ability, and it's always at the limits of what I know how to do. So I'm always kind of having to go, I don't know how to do this, maybe I'll try and learn a new way of doing it. And so it's kind of, there's a challenge there.
So that goes back to the idea of like the limitations between each of you have your own limitations. In your case, like this, the square poster format, every exhibition is in the same size.
Another sort of positive about, which is related to both Skelf and the Billboard site, which we spoke a little bit about earlier before the talk, is the sustainability in terms of the materiality of these projects. So what I found really interesting about making the artwork for Skelf, making something which it's an artwork that can only exist online, and thinking about how much material I used to make that work, whereas if it was in a physical space, you might spend more money on materials, or just in terms of kind of the environmental impacts of kind of working on an online immaterial space, and also with the Billboard site as well. So we're making a physical work in a sense that it's a huge poster, but the fact that it's pasted over the top of, again, and it's not this kind of art object which then becomes this kind of thing that degrades over years in someone's shed or collection or wherever. It's a lot more kind of sustainable, kind of environmentally as well.
But it's something for me to think that there's a value in that even when you take everything away. So the kind of value of artwork we are used to thinking of because it's singular and it's, there's only one of these and it's therefore precious, or, this took a long time and it's therefore precious. Whereas if we are making things with skills that anybody can teach themselves, anybody can do, it's being destroyed at the end of it, or online, if I broke my computer, Skelf would still exist. It doesn't, it's up in the cloud somewhere, and but yet there still feels like there's this value in the fact that it's been done, or the value that it exists somewhere, and that's been really positive for me. I think just like this is going back a bit again to like sort of audiences and different ways of engaging, but I just sort of continue to think about it, and in terms of your question about like positives and negatives of like either way of engaging, I think they're just different, and something that we've like been really keen on is just like trying to do like it in as many ways as possible, which is actually also something I sort of do in my own practice, is like try things out again and again in different ways. And so like things like we did a podcast for a previous project, but seeing that you guys with Skelf were doing a podcast for this run of Skelf was so exciting, because we were like, that's something after we did it the first time that we wanted to do again. Particularly because the starting point of Cypher was to have conversations. It was like a crypt discussion group. And yeah, but then, so what I was going to say was that it's been really lovely doing things like when we had the event, Dan's event, across the road rather than behind the billboard. We had loads of people who were like passing the billboard every day, being like, oh, what's going on? I see that all the time, but like, let's have a chat. And that was like an amazing direct way of like creating those conversations. But then differently, I bumped into somebody the other day who said that they'd been following the project on Instagram and had listened to the podcast and used to go to the school across the road. And so, like, I think there's like, by just having a flexibility to your ways of working and ways of like being up for having discussions and engaging, that's just enriching.
You were talking about the benefits and the limitations that you each have, and I'm just wondering, do you think that artists push themselves more when they actually have those limitations?
I just think that limitations are the most helpful thing often, and that's usually where something, I mean, speaking as an artist, maybe more than as being behind Skelf, but usually when there is a limit, it's the bit that shapes where you're going. And actually, probably the restrictions that made Skelf come about was the fact that, okay, I want to work with artists, I want to collaborate on things, I want to put projects on, but I don't have any money and I don't have physical space. Okay, what have I got? It kind of gives you a new thing.
I think that attitude as well of making things happen for yourself rather than kind of passively waiting for another some kind of institution to knock on your door if they perhaps maybe break down in a car one day and happen to like need a phone call and they happen to come into your studio and like I don't know what people hope happens these days, but because there is this huge load of mid-level galleries that are closing that would have in the past would have built up younger artists' careers. The fact that a lot of these mid-level galleries don't exist anymore, I think it is interesting that limitation has resulted in a lot of artist-led projects and people going out there making stuff happen on their own terms. And
is it frozen?
The exciting thing, yeah.
So going to the I don't know if
Can you guys?
Can you hear us?
No. Well, just now there was a sudden dip. We couldn't hear you very well, that last bit, that last sentence.
No worries.
Can you hear us now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, going back to what you were saying, the rise of artist-led projects and all of this. Do you think that now with the economic and political pressures, it's more like there's more like an emergence of collectives working together rather than individual practices?
I think that's really interesting. I think that there has been a movement towards that to kind of go against the sort of all too often story of artists as lonely, isolated self-entrepreneurs. I think that it's interesting that a lot of artists do want to come together and collaborate. I think there's a lot of strength in that.
Yeah, but I think it's also important to remember that like every generation thinks that they're just like doing it for the first time, but actually like we're part of a sort of wider history and context of artists who were always using these like collaborative strategies to survive, to continue to make work and
So Sophos, what was your defining factor to be involved in a collective rather than individually?
I think that one thing that joins all these teams is I really agree with what Holly was saying. A lot of times when you think about these limitations and the idea of whether the project is sustainable or not, or even the whole situation where in the end what the three entities of us have done as well in working together is making not just physical face-to-face involvements, but also kind of uploading these connections into kind of online community or the possibility of. But in the end, it's really just about the meaning of it being created by the people who used it and were involved in it and then could pass it on. So in a sense, I really do feel that aliveness of the connection is what is the real future or the real body of any of these content that we're making. So in that sense, the way I see the future of it is also as how it passes on and how those connections we build through collaboration also give way to new or other potential things in the future. So I really do feel that it's a very organic engagement and investment that ends up surviving in that sense. And maybe these online endeavors and the physical ones we do, they help us to grow that basically intangible bond between each other and between our shared communities. So that's really where I see it.
So, what about you, Claire? What are the benefits of working in a collaborative process?
Oh, we can hear that.
Well,
So that was a question for Claire.
yeah, about working in a collaborative process. I think it's essential for artists to survive, if nothing else, just to be amongst other artists. I'm involved in running a studio group, which is charity, and it's, that's quite a lot of work, and I often think to myself, why are we bothering with this when we could actually just work from home or, work in a kind of private space? It would be much less time consuming and easier to work alone. But like you say about all the opportunities disappearing and once you leave art school, you're very much on your own. If nobody's knocking on your door and offering you exhibitions and things like this, you could very quickly think, well, what's my practice, what's the point? And maybe a lot of the best parts of it, the most productive or the fruitful parts to move forward are the bits where you just happen to have a cup of tea with somebody else and you have an interesting conversation, and that leads somewhere, or that sustains you for a few weeks longer as an artist. And yeah, I think it's...
I guess this idea of collective also links back to the Art Lakes weekend and the theme of interdependence. And how do you feel your practices in your projects are in line with the theme of this year?
I guess it's everything we've been talking about, isn't it? It's I've personally, on a very personal level, we didn't start out like as a collective, Erin, Amber and myself, and we went to something the other day, organised by Pacto, which was called Collectives as Catalysts, and it was a talk event, and Amber and I went along. Everyone was going like, oh, what collective are you in? And we're like, oh, we're in a collective. Sort of like an organic thing that happened. But yeah, definitely I've found that working with others to sort of organise and to like pool resources has been like really enriching and amazing. And it's, I guess like the whole idea of interdependence, which I chatted about with Holly, who runs Art Lakes a bit, was like thinking, I guess, about like the counterbalance as well of collectives or groups or spaces or organisations as like defining themselves as independent, which often you're sort of like trying to carve out sort of sensible autonomy for yourself or yourselves, because you feel at odds with the structures around you, and I think that's still really important, but actually also acknowledging that it's never really a standalone game, and that you inevitably will always be like pooling resources with others, and like Erin said, actually trying to totally extrapolate yourself from the system isn't necessarily always possible. So it's like, how do you sort of like navigate that? How do you move between it? It's like questions we're constantly talking about, I guess, in the project.
And I suppose as artists as well, we're kind of answering those questions through making. So it kind of manifests in different ways, like through doing artist-led projects to answer those questions, but also even making an artwork is still trying to answer the same questions.
I think it gives you a freedom to do something else other than what you do as an artist. So I don't, you operate under the name CypherBILLBOARD or Softball Studs, or my work with Skelf is quite different to the work I make as an artist, as an individual, and it means that by not working under my own name, I've got this kind of complete freedom to put things on that maybe are at odds to what might be my taste or my values or my ideas, or and to kind of play in another way that isn't connected to this image we have to, or perhaps we don't have to, but we expect that we present this development of yourself in your practice as this autonomous thing. I work in these ideas and with these materials, and it's just it's freeing in a way to work under a name.
And I guess before we close the conversation, it would be lovely to know what you're working towards, and also because I know that you've recently launched the podcast. It's quite a new thing that you've been doing. What else do you all have in mind in the close future?
Well, Skelf has got a new project opening on Wednesday. The podcast has been going. We've had this will be the 4th episode that comes out of this 4th quarterly exhibition. So we've got 8 shows programmed in this quarterly series. The next one is Curator Projects, the Jetpacks, and is kind of quite a spacey thing, and it's called Online Presence, and it's very much about, I guess, the internet and celebration of the internet. So that's our next project. So that's as soon as the CypherBILLBOARD form comes down on Tuesday night. That one goes up.
Speedy switch.
What about you guys?
So